So recently I started watching JoJo's Bizarre Adventure for the first time in my life, and I just caught up to part 3. And truth be told, part 3, it was awesome. It was great. I'm sure y'all want to know where I rank part 3 amongst the other JoJo's parts so far. Did I like part 3 more than I liked part 2? This might be a hot take. I thought part 2 was better, and I'll get into why in a second. I have a lot to talk about part 3. I mean, it was the longest JoJo's part, and of course all of this is my opinion, but I'll talk about part 3 real quick. The way I would describe part 3 is very weird. Out of all of the episodes in part 3, 48 episodes in total, I thought the beginning was absolutely phenomenal. Might be some of the best opening episodes. No, I will say part 3 had the best opening episodes between part 1 and part 2. You know, the first few episodes of part 3 introduce us to Jotaro, Avdol, Kakyoin, Polnareff, the concept of stands, the return of Dio. There is so much that goes on within the first couple episodes of part 3. It by far has the best introduction of any part. And if part 3 would have kept going at that pace, it would have surpassed part 2. Now when we take a look back at the 48 episodes, not only was the introductory episodes great, the ending to part 3 was the best ending out of any part, in my opinion, of course. Every single episode, from the moment that Vanilla Ice was introduced to the moment that Dio is defeated, I would say all of those episodes is peak JoJo's. Some of y'all have watched my part 2 video. You guys know how highly I was talking about Joseph versus Cars. Jotaro versus Dio surpasses that. To me, it is the greatest conclusion at any JoJo's part that I've seen so far. And it also had the best introduction to any JoJo's part I've seen so far. So logically, where part 3 falters in comparison to part 2 is everything in between. And not to say that those episodes in the middle were bad, I would say it was hit or miss. We had some amazing episodes in that bunch, like Jotaro versus Darby. That might be like a top 5 episode in part 3 to me. But then we had Polnareff versus the guy who makes you into a baby. Wow, I have no words for that episode. So there were a couple stand fights in the middle that I did appreciate and I did like, but then there were some stand fights that I was just like, what am I looking at? And there was just so many fights. It was a fight this episode, a fight that episode. Maybe the fight carries on into the next episode if you're lucky. In some cases unlucky, like the Polnareff baby fight. That was a 2-episode fight. So with all the fighting going on, all the stands that are being shown in part 3, I can clearly see why this is one of the most talked about parts in JoJo's. Not just introducing stands, but giving us a lengthy part of just showing off the stands in many different shapes, sizes, forms, varieties, types. But I simply preferred the way that part 2 handled villains compared to the way that part 3 handled villains. I much prefer having a handful of villains that are hyped up and talked about and mentioned at the beginning of the part, and then we build towards those fights. Because the way that I view part 3, and some of y'all are gonna have to hear me out on this, some of y'all won't even know what I'm talking about. Since there was villain after villain after villain and fight after fight after fight, most of them were completely unimportant in the grand scheme of things. It really feels like in Pokemon walking into like a gym and then you have to beat all the optional trainers before you get to the gym leader. I just want to beat the gym leader. I want to get to that Dio fight, but we have to fight Dio Grunt after Dio Grunt after Dio Grunt after Dio Grunt, and some of them are fine. I feel like this could have been circumvented by at least giving the characters some backstory, some writing. As the viewer, give me a reason to care about these antagonists that keep popping up, because sometimes the stand will be able to carry the character, but sometimes it won't. And those episodes in part 3 where the villain isn't interesting, where the stand isn't interesting, where the fight isn't interesting, is what drags it below part 2. Because when I look at the episode count of part 2, I really believe in my heart of hearts that every single episode in part 2 is a hit. And again, I want to clarify, I'm not slandering part 3. There hasn't been a JoJo's part that I've not enjoyed. They've all been great watches. I'm just telling you where I'm coming from and why I prefer part 2 over part 3. But the discussion as to which JoJo's part is superior, in like your own eye, of course, because it's all subjective, it's so interesting to me, because I'll be reading a comment and it will say part 3 is the best part, I love part 3, I cannot wait for you to watch part 3. And then another comment will be like part 3 filler. But there's so much that part 3 does great that I am kind of upset that it drags, because the main cast is amazing. I really think this is the best main cast I've seen so far in JoJo's, and I love Joseph and I love they're still probably in my top 2 favorite characters, both of them. And the part 1 cast is iconic, but we don't see part 1 nor the part 2 cast interact with each other at the extent that the part 3 cast does. And that was one of the strongest parts parts about Stardust Crusaders, in my opinion, is seeing the cast interact with each other and seeing their funny moments, seeing them joke around with each other, just hang out in all these different places on Earth. I much preferred moments like that than seeing a stand fight with a stand that I wasn't fully invested in. But maybe I'm weird. Maybe I'm the odd one. To people who just absolutely love fights, I can see this being their favorite part. I know myself, and I can only speak for myself because we all have different preferences in what we want to see in an anime. I like the little stuff more. I love a good fight. I love Jotaro versus Dio. But I also like to see a cast that I'm invested in, characters that I care for interact with other characters that I enjoy. I like moments between Polnareff and Iggy. I like moments with Avdol and Joseph. You know, I like these characters. I've grown attached to these characters, so I enjoy watching these characters interact with other characters that I've grown attached to. I don't enjoy it as much when I'm watching these characters that I'm attached to fight characters that I have no idea who they are and they're not going to be important to the story at all past this episode. So if we could have gotten more moments like that, I think I would have loved part 3. I think the word that I'm looking for is like slice of life, I guess. Not saying the entire part had to be slice of life, but with as many locations as we're visiting in part 3, with as many characters as we're being introduced to in part 3, some slice of life moments mixed in there could have gone a long way. But I understand, people in the comment section were saying part 3, it's a product of its time, and despite that, it still had all-time great moments. So please don't interpret this as me like slandering part 3. Again, genuinely don't think that JoJo's has had a bad part yet. And from what I've gathered in the comment section, people say that like the first part is the worst part, and I even like that one. So I love seeing how different JoJo's parts get received by different people. So I'm just letting y'all know how I felt about part 3. But at the end of the day, part 3 is still competing for my attention just like any other form of media in the world. JoJo's beat out all of them. So regardless, bottom line, whatever I have to say, I was still watching. But if anything, I was thinking about making, you know, my favorite stands, my favorite fights in JoJo's, videos like that after I caught up to the series. So part 3 gave me a lot to talk about at the very least. I will say I feel like part 3 is definitely a rewatchable part because you don't need to rewatch it from start to end to enjoy it. I feel like I can just turn on any episode, watch a stand fight, and be happy with my life. As long as it's not Polnareff versus the baby guy, I think I'll be fine. But let's talk about part 3 on an episode by episode basis, especially about the way that it kicked off. So Jotaro just calls his mama, you know, that's when I knew part 3 had everything it took to become one of the funniest parts in JoJo's. But jokes aside, Jotaro had one of the coolest introductions of any of the JoJo's, just shown to be an absolute like hard-boiled badass. I think episode 1 of part 3 did an amazing job at showing what Jotaro is like on the exterior as well as what he's like on the interior. Obviously, exterior, he's locked up, his cellmates fear him, the police fear him, he's cussing at his mom, you know, that's quite rebellious, I guess. But even when he's asked by the police to leave, he refuses, because as far as he's aware, there's an evil spirit possessing him. So even though he's portrayed to be the most, I guess, metal, badass JoJo so far, he still has the fundamental, I suppose, protective nature of the other JoJo's, because he willingly is staying in jail to prevent this evil spirit from causing harm to anybody else. And we see other characters get introduced with the primary focus of showing off Jotaro's softer side, like his mom, like Anne. So even though he's portrayed to be absolutely just like epic sauce right here, he's no different from Jonathan, and he's no different from Joseph in the sense that they all care about the people close to him and they all want to protect them. Simple as that. But the second that Jotaro mentioned evil spirits, I was like, stands. Finally, we're getting introduced to stands. You know, before getting into JoJo's, I didn't know much. I knew a couple characters. I knew about Dio and I knew about Jotaro. I also knew about stands. No idea what Hamon was, but I knew stands, which I guess goes to show just how big and major part 3 really is. So I was very excited to see what all the hype was about when it came to stands, and I didn't expect it to be this early, but I'm glad it was, because episode 1, first couple stands we see, Magician's Red and Star Platinum. Obviously, we see Magician's Red after the introduction of Avdol, which is a character that I strongly believe should have gotten more screen time, should have been in more stand fights. I feel like some of the stand fights could have been cooler had it been a different character in them and they'd not just all be Polnareff fights. But Avdol, absolutely epic character, an epic stand, which I guess leads me to the point that I think every main character has an amazing stand. You know, some of the villains that were introduced that were only there for like one episode and to lose and that's it, some of them had pretty weak stands. That's understandable. I think every single character of the main cast great stand. Star Platinum, Magician's Red, Silver Chariot, Hierophant Green, Hermit Purple, you name it. And then of course we go to the main villain like Dio, the world, amazing. So as far as stands go, you know, I believe the hype. I'm understanding why people say that they're pretty awesome, because when it comes to actual relevant characters that get screen time, not one of them has disappointed me, not one. And this might be a hot take, but I feel like it would have been a waste to give a phenomenal stand to one of these D-class villains that lose in one episode. You know, some of them had cool stands, but nothing like the world, nothing like Hierophant Green, nothing like Magician's Red. Well, that's enough, you know, I guess fanboying. You can see that I like stands. And you know, part 1 also shows us some details about stands. Stuff like hurting a stand is going to hurt the user as well. And verbatim, they are described as being a powerful vision created by one's own life energy. And in later episodes regarding stands, we see their relationship to like tarot cards. And some stands are named after like Egyptian gods and whatnot, which I believe is going to stop. I've been told that later on the stands are going to be like musical references and stuff like that. So that might be a part 3 exclusive thing, but I don't know. I'll have to see. Episode 1 of part 3, no complaints from me. The strongest first episode of any part for sure so far. And it ends off with them teasing the fact that Dio is back. He's awakened. And not only is he awakened, but he has taken over Jonathan's body. So now we have the build up towards the Dio fight. We have our crew's end goal. Defeat Dio. Did it need to take 48 episodes to get there? I don't think so. But hey, you know, what can I do about it? But moving on to episode 2, we have a character introduction. This time we're introduced to Kakyoin. Now I have the same critique, I guess, of him that I have of Avdol. Not of his character, definitely not, but more so the fact that I wish we got to see him fight more. Some of those stand fights would have been a lot more interesting had it been Kakyoin instead of, again, Polnareff. And it doesn't help that there's like a lengthy segment of part 3 where he is just like out of commission. And same thing with Avdol, now that I realize it. Avdol also was missing for a couple episodes there in part 3 when he fought Whole Horse. But now that I think about it, Polnareff never had to sit out for a lengthy period of time, which is maybe why it felt like he took up so much screen time. Because unlike the other characters, we just never got a break. But back to Kakyo, and he's actually introduced as a bad guy. We see him fight off against Jotaro, and it is definitely one of the most interesting fights in part 3, probably due to the fact that these are two characters who are going to get extensive screen time and extensive writing in part 3 and not just throwaway characters. And not just that, but also the dynamic that Kakyoin later on becomes part of the crew. But obviously in the moment I didn't know that. I just saw Emerald splash and I was like, wow, this is awesome. But we find out that Kakyoin is not a bad guy, but he had a flesh bud implanted in him by Dio. And everybody's saying, oh, he's gonna die, he's gonna die. Jotaro doesn't let him die. So I think this is the episode where we start finding out that most of the crew has had run-ins with Dio before, mainly Dio trying to implant people with flesh buds. So that becomes a big motivator for most of the crew as to why they should stop Dio, alongside Jotaro's mom developing a stand. And we're told that she doesn't have the mental fighting strength and the stand is working against her and that's why it's harming her. And 3 episodes into part 3, we're slapped with a time limit, as if going out and hunting Dio wasn't a good enough motivator enough. We now have 50 days until Jotaro's mom dies. So I was like, oh, it's on now. 3 episodes in, we got the big bad guy, the strongest villain that we faced so far. We got a time limit set like Majora's Mask, and we got to make it all the way to Egypt. So logically, I'm thinking this is gonna be epic. We got amazing world building incoming. We got the best JoJo's antagonist so far on the horizon, and we got high stakes. And again, we ended up getting that. It just, you know, took too long. I know I keep hammering that point in, but truthfully, the fact that part 3 drags on is really the only flaw that I can see in it. So now moving on to the 4th episode, this is really the first time that we see a Dio grunt, I suppose. Obviously, we just got done talking about Kakyoin, but Kakyoin number 1 goes on to become an actual character. And number 2, he had a flesh bud implanted in him. This is a Dio grunt fight that takes place while the crew is on a plane, which marks one of the last times that we see the crew on a plane, because they don't want to endanger the lives of everybody else who's not involved in taking out Dio, which makes a lot of sense. It also marks another Joseph plane crash, which I found to be a funny gag. But as for the fight, it's just any other stand fight. You know, I saw comments of people saying, you know, the part 3 video is going to be like an hour long since part 3 is so long, right? But when I make videos like these, I try to talk about bullet points of the moments that are of the utmost importance. A lot of these fights are, you know, quite frankly, I don't think that they're that important, which is different from enjoyable, by the way. I hope people don't think that that's a fight can be non-important and still enjoyable. But I don't think that detailing every single stand fight and everything that happened in these fights is pivotal to knowing the overarching plot of part 3. But I could be wrong. When I get to part 7, might turn out the guy that turned Polnareff into a baby strongest person in the universe right now. Do I think that's gonna happen? Not in a million years. But if it does happen, I'll make a public apology video. I just don't think that a lot of these stand fights are essential, I guess. I mean, this video would really drag on if I talked about every single moment of the fight where Joseph had to fight that little hemorrhoid in his arm. Of course, I'll talk about my favorite stand fights, but the stand fight isn't even the most important part of this episode, because the most important part is us landing in Hong Kong and meeting Polnareff. Now, Polnareff, I've been giving him a lot of slack. He's an amazing character, but I've been hating on him a little bit, you know, just joking around because he gets up all the screen time. You know, just share the love, share some screen time with the other great characters in the cast, and I would have no problem with Polnareff. Just like Kakyoin, he's introduced as like a villain, and this time, you know, Polnareff's hair, you know how his hair is. So I'm looking at his forehead, I'm like, is there a flesh bud in him? And I don't see a flesh bud. So I was like, oh, this guy is like actually evil. He's really bad. But I knew that wasn't the case when I saw his stand, because I was like, wait, his stand is a little too cool to be given to Dio Employee of the Month number 58. And as we all know, he does end up becoming part of the crew. But wow, his fight with Avdol was great. You see, like, I don't hate fights. I don't hate stand fights. I love stand fights between characters that I actually care about, though. We also get Polnareff's motivation, which is to avenge his sister from one of the guys that Dio has, you know, employed, I suppose. So bottom line, I do like Polnareff's character. I like his motivation. But something is wrong when people are saying part 3 Polnareff's Bizarre Adventure. You get what I mean? And we're not that far off the next character introduction in part 3, which is Anne. And now that I finished part 3, Anne is such like what what character? I thought she would be a main character of the crew. She wasn't. I don't know what her purpose was, to be honest. I think her purpose was to show Jotaro's soft side and caring side, but I felt like we got that with the interactions with his mom. So at this point, like, the fact that her character was kind of like a nothing burger in part 3, I don't know, that's a little bit harsh, right? But I refuse to believe that that was her entire character. In my mind, I'm like 99% sure she's gonna come back in part 4 or 5 or whatever it is. There wasn't much there. There was a pretty cool stand fight with the guy that brought Jotaro underwater. That was a pretty cool stand, I admit. And then the orangutan stand, not important, but it showed us the difference that, you know, some stands are visible to people who don't have stand abilities. And it also showed us that animals can have stands. I remember when I watched that episode for the first time, I thought that somebody turned a human into an orangutan using a stand. No, the orangutan had the stand. Not a very important stand fight, not a very good one, but just showed us that concept of, look, animals can have stands. Don't be surprised about Iggy down the line. But with that stand fight wrapped up, I would say that this is the point where we hit the Rocky segment of part 3. You remember the little episode count that I showed earlier on in the video? Yeah, look at it. We're now in the Rocky segment. So a lot of these fights don't need to be talked over. A lot of these episodes don't need to be summarized. I will talk about the ones that I like, though, saving all of my judgment for a video in the future where I talk about every JoJo's fight, maybe. Let me know if y'all want to see that. I would say the next important fight is, funnily enough, like 3 episodes later. The crew is in India and Polnareff gets wind that the guy who killed his sister is nearby. So then we get a fight between Polnareff and the crew. Kind of reminded me of Caesar fighting with Joseph. Everybody's telling Polnareff, don't do it. It's not safe right now. But Polnareff wants to kill that man. But the crew also ends up finding Whole Horse, and Avdol dies. I was like, surely they didn't kill Avdol off that quickly. And later we find out that they didn't, because he comes back. But there were a couple episodes there where he wasn't present. I was like, they really killed Avdol. But even though Avdol ended up coming back, majority of these stand fights felt very low stakes, because you knew that nobody was gonna get hurt. You knew nobody was gonna die. And I feel like that's why Darby's fight was so impressive, because he took the soul of Polnareff. It's also why this fight is so impressive. For a split second there, I really thought Avdol was dead, because after like 5 episodes of stand fights, I'm like, it's gonna be the same thing over and over again. The crew's gonna fight, they're gonna come out on top. But that subversion of expectations where, look, Avdol died, made me like this fight a whole lot more than any other stand fight. And Polnareff getting his revenge on the guy that killed his sister, it was a good fight too. I liked his stand. It was just a little bit anticlimactic. We then go through another stretch of episodes where it's stand fights after stand fights. There was a stand fight with the old hag that was only somewhat entertaining because she was related to the man that killed Polnareff's sister. I would say the next episode of importance is probably episode 21, where the crew stops by Avdol's dad's place and Avdol comes back, which, funnily enough, that moment alone captured my attention far more than the stand fight. So it is just stand fight after stand fight after stand fight until they get to Egypt. I was under the impression, hey, once we get to Egypt, we're gonna get to the real meat and potatoes of the story. I was wrong. I was wrong. It's fine. The stand fights definitely improved in quality once we got to Egypt, though. Most importantly, we get a new addition to the crew Iggy, who I think is unanimously the GOAT of part 3. And if I remember correctly, I believe this is the part where Kakyoin gets hurt and misses a whole bunch of episodes. He deserved a lot better stand fights. I mean, he did have the fight with Jotaro, and of course, the awesome moment with Dio. Honestly, his moment with Dio when he was the only one smart enough to figure out what the world did, one of my favorite moments in part 3. Kakyoin was great. I think the next important stand fight was the one with Boingo. Not really one of my favorites, but he's a recurring character. At least he shows up in like one other episode. The episode was more so comic relief than like an actual fight, so I liked it in that sense. Like, yeah, it was funny. The Anubis fight was also very good. I liked that stand fight a whole lot. But then from here on out, the crew is going stand fight after stand fight until they reach Cairo. And once they reach Cairo, I was like, finally, at last, no more Little League villains. We're on to Dio. I was wrong. But I was gladly wrong this time, because the first fight that we get when we get to Cairo is the Darby fight. Definitely my favorite stand fight besides Vanilla Ice and Dio. I don't even know if I can call this a fight. It really is just a game of poker, and it is the greatest game of poker ever played. I love this episode so much. Specifically that moment where Jotaro puts everything on the line. He puts his soul. He puts Avdol's soul. He bets the soul of Kakyoin, who didn't even consent to having his soul bargained. And then he puts the soul of his mom on the line with a trash. It was perfection. What a great episode. Not only was the psychology of the episode like top tier, I myself was wondering, what does he have in that hand? S tier stand fight for sure. Loved it. The next stand fight I remember enjoying a lot was the Iggy one. The one with the bird where he gets to hear what's going on inside of Iggy's mind. So unsuspecting. A fight between a dog and a bird. One of the better stand fights of part 3. Anything is possible, honestly. And that fight was also very important because it's how we found out where Dio's base was located at. And even when we get into Dio's base, there's still more stand fights. I was like, damn, there's a stand fight everywhere. The one with the other Darby, the video game Darby, it wasn't as good, not in my opinion. It was enjoyable, but the stakes didn't feel as high, and it didn't feel as unique because we saw this same concept used with a different medium. Now, when we got to the Vanilla Ice fight, that's when I say, look, part 3 was untouchable. There was no other period of episodes, I guess is what I would call it, that was better than this end segment of part 3. We went on a stretch of episodes where everything was, I would say, like 10 out of 10, which is why part 3 is so difficult to rank. We got the highest of the highs with the lowest of the lows, to be honest, but I can't knock the highs because that's what I'm gonna remember down the line when I catch up to JoJo's. I'll look back at part 3 and I'll be like, wow, that Dio fight was so good. The Vanilla Ice fight was actually absurd. It starts off with Avdol literally just dying. And it wasn't even a death where I'm like, oh, he can come back from this. It was like a death. I'm like, oh, this time he's done for sure. It was nothing pretty about it. Nothing cinematic. No over dramatic, slow. It was just, oh, he's dead now. Oh, wow. That's how we're doing it? In Dio's mansion, that's how we're coming? Okay, I guess. I mean, Vanilla Ice has one of the best stands in part 3, by the way. Literally just disintegrating everything in its path. Okay, actually, I don't like Vanilla Ice because I just realized what he did to Iggy. You know, Avdol was a quick death. He made sure Iggy felt pain. That was, you know, that was beyond the line. This was definitely the best Polnareff fight. He actually figured out what Vanilla Ice's weaknesses was, which was very impressive. And he got saved by Iggy too, which was sad. Sad, I guess. All in all, the second best fight in part 3, in my opinion. I can get behind this stand fight because number 1, one of the coolest stands in part 3. Number 2, there was actually stuff on the line. Avdol and Iggy, they didn't sacrifice themselves for nothing. And number 3, Vanilla Ice didn't feel like a grunt. He felt like Dio's right hand man. So he didn't feel like an NPC that you had to beat and move on with. He felt like a mini boss. I feel like a nerd putting stuff into video game terms, but you know, we're all watching anime, right? So, but after Vanilla Ice, we got the infamous Dio fight. Now, something I want to point out, that scene with Polnareff and Dio on the steps, when I saw that, I thought the Dio stand was to reverse time or put people in a loop. When I found out the Dio stand was to stop time, it made me go back to that scene and be like, is Dio setting him back on the steps on purpose? He's not freezing him on the steps. He's purposely moving him backwards. And then a large portion of the Dio fight is trying to figure out what is his stand to begin with. That's been the goal throughout this entire journey. What is his stand? And I've already mentioned it. I've already talked about it. Kakyoin finding out the world is his stand. My favorite moment in part 3. Then we proceed to have the Dio fight with Jotaro. Dio almost killing Joseph. We have the moment where Jotaro and Dio walk towards each other, and I'm pretty sure that's the moment in the manga with like the iconic panel. I've seen that panel. And it was like a 3-episode long fight. If I'm not mistaken, it was a very very long fight. And to be honest, it's probably the only fight in part 3 that I can justify it being as long as it was. Everything about it was just masterful. I love seeing Dio catch Jotaro in the world and being cautious enough to not kill him multiple times. At times I was like, could he have killed him? But again, Dio wants this. It's not like Dio is messing around. It's not like he's having fun. I'm pretty sure if Dio could have killed him, he would have killed him. He just couldn't find an opportunity. Star Platinum being able to move in the world, apparently because they are the same type of stand. It is 100% the JoJo's fight up until this point with the most like cinematic and epic feel. Like, this is the finale. This is the final boss, not just of part 3 of JoJo's, it feels like. So I don't know where we're gonna go from here in terms of antagonists. I don't know if Dio is still alive. I'm more inclined to believe that he's dead this time. But wow, now that I've caught up to part 3, I can say I have no idea what's going to happen in JoJo's moving forward. Don't know any characters, don't know any stand, don't know who the antagonist is going to be. I know nothing at all. And I'm excited. I mean, I've enjoyed JoJo's this much with minor spoilers. Now that I've gotten to the point where it's like I'm completely blind, I can't wait to see what I got in store. Part 3 was great. I've heard fantastic stuff about part 4. And I'll catch you guys in the next JoJo's part. Hopefully it doesn't take me 2 weeks to upload. Hopefully next Sunday, part 4 video will be up. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, please like, subscribe, put a lot of effort into this video, and check out my JoJo series where I'm watching JoJo's Blind. Take care, everybody. Peace.